Recording. 2 weeks ago, we started our review of the structural diagramming because, as I mentioned, there are some parts in the narrative that are helpful to do the diagram to see, especially the time, the sections in the narrative where there is instruction happening. Just as we saw in John 4, there's really 3 places where Jesus offers instruction to one to the woman at the well regarding living water, and then a second instruction he gives to her regarding true worship. And then he gives some instruction to the disciples regarding the fact he has been sent and that they too are being sent by him. So those would be 3 places that would be helpful to diagram, because in any instructional passage, there are the way that the statements are made. The diagram helps to break those down to see what the author is emphasizing and focusing on, and then to see what the other phrases and such are modifying. So I spent a little time sort of reviewing the structural diagram, and in the course of that, if you remember, there was a number of grammatical aspects and features that we were talking about. So what I thought I would do was take it one step back and sort of talk about how paragraphs are structured, sentences, and just try to give you some more insights into English grammar and how that can help us with the diagramming. So as we go through, again, if there are any questions, please, wave your hands or scream or do something to get my attention, and we'll stop and answer your questions, because I want to make sure, I want to try to help you with this, because I really think if you can do well at diagramming, it will really help your when you study and preach the epistles, because those are all instructional. But it will also help you with poetry, because poems, again, while they are written in a figurative way, are also instructional. And so they have some structure that a diagram can help to show. And then thirdly, like I said, in narratives even, there are some places where a diagram can be very helpful. In narratives, you'll do the least amount of diagramming, because most narratives are stories, and so our analysis is really focused on the scenes and the characters and those things. But as I said, there are some places within narratives where the diagramming can be of benefit. So let me pull up our notes. Okay, hopefully you can see those. And again, we're on the structural diagram section and moving towards I just wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of epistles, because again, we'll start there because that's where the diagramming is most helpful. And remember, an epistle is a didactic or a teaching literature. Basically, it's intended to give instructions, commands, explanations of those commands, explanations of particular doctrinal truths. And so an epistle is made up of paragraphs. If you were to think of an epistle like a piece of pie, what is the coconut? The word for coconut? Buko, right? Buko? So if you have my favorite pie is buko pie, right? Coconut.
Buko pie.
I love it. So if you
The
think
young
of,
coconut.
yes, that's very good. So if you think of an epistle like a buko, a coconut pie, and it's got several pieces, right? You don't eat the whole thing, you eat it in pieces. And those pieces you can think of are paragraphs. All right? An epistle is made up of a series of paragraphs. Each paragraph represents a unit of thought. So for example, if you're reading the epistle to the Ephesians, the first paragraph in Ephesians is a declaration of praise. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that first paragraph is a form of praise. The second paragraph is then a prayer. The third paragraph in the epistle is focused on who we were before salvation. You know, you were dead in your trespasses and sins, but God made you alive. So each epistle is made up of several paragraphs, and in each of those paragraphs is a unit of thought. Now, if we break that down further and take one piece of the pie, again, the whole pie represents the epistle. One piece of the pie represents a paragraph. Now, if we take out one piece, a paragraph is made up of sentences. Several, could be one long sentence or several sentences, but those sentences all come together to express that particular unit of thought within the paragraph. All right, so again, the whole pie is the epistle. One piece of that pie represents a paragraph, and there will be several paragraphs within the whole epistle. And now if I take that piece out, that piece is made up of several sentences. So you can think of it maybe like the topping and the crust and the inner part, the custard, the pudding. Those all represent sentences that make up the paragraph. Okay? Now if I take each sentence and break it down, a sentence is made up of clauses and phrases. Okay? So you take a sentence and it's going to have what are called clauses. Those are basically a series of words that contain a verb and a subject, or a phrase. And a phrase does not have a verb, it does not have the verb and the subject together. It may have one or the other, but not both. I'll explain that in a minute. But I just want you to get the picture in your mind of the epistle is made up of paragraphs. Each paragraph is made up of sentences, and each sentence is made up of clauses and phrases. Okay? And so as you build your sentence, you're putting clauses and phrases together, and they're all connected somehow. The phrases, there's a main clause, and then there's phrases and clauses that modify that main clause. And that main clause is part of what makes up the sentence, which is part of the paragraph. You have several sentences within a paragraph, potentially, and then you have each paragraph is a unit of thought that put together makes up the whole epistle. Okay? And so it's the same idea if you have an instructional portion of a narrative that the speaker may be speaking in one paragraph or several paragraphs, all right? In the case of Jesus's instruction in John 4, each of those three dialogues where he gives instruction, each of those is really one paragraph, all right? But that paragraph is made up of sentences, and those sentences are made up of clauses and phrases that are linked together, all right? And so that's how we can picture it. Think of a buko pie, with each piece being a paragraph, each paragraph made up of different layers that represent the sentences within that paragraph. And then within those layers, you have ingredients, maybe sugar or some other fruits or something. Those would be the clauses and phrases, all right, that make up the sentence. Okay? So with that picture in your mind, I'm going to give you several clauses or phrases, and what I want you to do is I'll just ask you to identify two things for me, all right? I want you to first tell me if what I show you is a phrase or a clause, and then whether it actually, before we do that, I need to explain for a second phrases. So let's do this first. All right, a sentence. Who can tell me what a sentence is? If you were to define a sentence. Yeah, Anselmo?
Sentence.
Oh, go ahead, Sid.
Sentence is a group of words, is a word or group of words that expresses a complete idea or thought.
Good. Excellent. And notice the word complete. All right? That's very, very, very important word there. It's a group of words, and we might say phrases and clauses. Clause or clauses that express a complete thought or idea. All right? It can contain additional phrases or clauses that modify, but there's a central thought that's being expressed, and that thought or idea is expressed in the main sentence. And I'll explain that in a minute. Okay. Now we see these words here. Clause. Let's talk about that for a minute. Let me scroll down here. Oh. Okay. Now a clause. So what I want to do is this. I want to give you an understanding, the difference between a clause and a phrase. A clause, simply think of it this way, contains a subject and a verb. Okay? So, who can tell me what a subject is? When I say a subject and a verb, what do I mean by subject?
The subject is the main uh, uh, person or that is taking the action or doing the action.
Good. That's the key. The main person, or could be a object, a thing that is doing the action. Okay? That is doing the action. All right? Now the verb is the action. Okay? So it's the action that is done, the action done by a subject, or, and this is important, or the verb describes the state of the subject, state or condition. I'll explain what I mean by that. Well, let me do it there. So, for example, he is happy. Now, notice this verb is, that's a verb. It's not an action, right? It's not, he's not doing something. He is something. So, we can have two kinds of verbs. There's one verb is he walked home. All right? Now, in this case, the verb is an action. Walked. Okay, he's doing something. What is the subject?
He.
He. He is doing, or we could just say this. Let's be more specific. Pastor Noor walked home. All right? So the verb, the action is walked. Pastor Noor is the subject, the one who did the action. Okay? Now, in this first sentence, is describes the action, but it's not really an action, it's a state, it's a condition. He is happy. She was sad. They were lost. Okay, it's telling a condition or a state. It's not describing an action, but that's also a verb. So a verb does two things. It can be an action done, or it describes the state or condition of the subject. Okay, that makes sense?
Being.
State of being.
State of being.
Yeah, so we could state of being, or you call it, or it's the action. So a subject either does an action, or the subject is described in some way. Okay, so those are those two kinds of verbs. So a clause contains a subject and a verb. All right, so for example here, this is a clause. He is happy. Subject he, verb is. In this one, Pastor Noor walked home, subject and a verb. Okay, you guys with me so far? I'm just going to break this down. We're going to go step by step. Now, there's one more. I'll wait for that. Okay, so for A, so a clause contains a subject and a verb. Essentially, we can look at a phrase is a group of words, a word or group of words that does not contain both a subject and a verb. So for example, with him. Okay, there's no subject here, right? There's no verb, there's no action that's taking place. With great excitement. Again, that's a phrase. There's not a subject and a verb that is a part of that, all right? And phrases are important because a phrase will always modify another word in the sentence, okay? A clause might modify another word in the sentence. Okay, now I say that because of this reason. There are two kinds of clauses. There's what's called an independent clause. That means it can stand alone. It forms a complete thought. Okay? He, or let's do it this way. Sid taught math. Okay? That forms a complete thought. Does this sentence, let me write another one here. Does this sentence, Sid taught, does that form a complete thought? Not necessarily, right? Or she is. Does that form a complete thought?
No.
It doesn't, right? Because she is what? Okay, or so an independent clause forms the complete thought. It contains the subject and the verb and usually an object. Okay, where the object is the recipient of the action. Okay, so we have three things going on here. We have a subject, a verb, and an object. This forms a complete sentence. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples.
Sentence pattern.
Yeah, that's a sentence pattern. Okay, that could be another way to look at it. All right, and so when we're thinking about an independent clause is a complete sentence. All right, so these are some examples. I followed the man I followed the man. Okay, that's a complete thought. What's the verb here? What's the action? That's Garzone. Why don't you look? What's the action here in this sentence?
Followed.
What's the verb?
Followed.
Followed, right?
Followed.
I'll underline that. What's the subject? Who's doing the action?
I.
Yeah, I is, right? Good. And then the object is the man. That's the thing receiving the action. All right? Or we could say Pastor Bobby threw the basketball. All right? Pastor Bobby, what's the action here?
True.
Threw, right? So that's my verb. What is who is the subject? What is doing the action? Who is doing the action?
Pastor Bobby.
You are. All right. Now, in this case, there's an object. Something is receiving that action, and that is the basketball. Okay. Now, an independent clause does not have to have an object, but it often does. But an independent clause definitely must have a subject and a verb that form a complete thought. Okay?
Mhm.
A dependent clause has a subject and a verb, but is not a complete thought.
Mhm.
So like, for example, I said he is. Okay? That is a clause because there is a verb and a subject, but it is not a complete thought. Now, why do I bring this up? Because an independent clause stands alone. A dependent clause modifies another word in the sentence. A phrase modifies a word in the sentence. Okay? So, what we have then is for a sentence, you're going to have a independent clause. That's the main subject and verb. All right? The
Mhm.
action and the one doing the action. In that same sentence, you may also have, so let me just, a sentence will have an independent clause and then possibly have other phrases and possibly other clauses. Other dependent. Okay? And that's what we have in a sentence. And so when we diagram, we're trying to identify every phrase and clause and to figure out what they're modifying and how they modify. All right? So that when I mentioned before, then a sentence contains a phrase, a clause, and possibly phrases, other phrases and clauses. That's what I'm trying to explain, the difference between a clause and a phrase. So a clause has a subject and verb. A phrase does not have both of those together, all right? We'll do some examples so I can, in fact, let's do that now. What I'm going to do is call on someone, and we'll just, what I'd like you to do, read the sentence, and then two things. One, identify, is the following a phrase or a clause? And then secondly, does this statement that I show you form a complete thought? That is it a sentence? Okay?
Mm.
So, Sid, we'll start with you. Go ahead and read it and then identify, is it a phrase or a clause? And does it form a complete thought?
I ran home. It's a clause.
It's a
And it's a
clause.
sentence. And it's a sentence.
Yeah, notice it's a clause because what is the verb?
Ran.
All right. And then the subject is?
I.
I, all right? So, and it forms a complete thought. It makes a statement. I ran home. All right? Some of these, we'll start out with some simple ones, and then I'll give you a little more complex ones. But Anselmo, let's do the second one. How about I ran? Is that a phrase or a clause?
Iran,
And Anselmo.
Iran is the enemy of
Oh.
America.
Okay, go ahead, Pastor Bobby. Is this a phrase or a clause?
A phrase.
I know you're making a joke too.
Clause.
Joke on. Yeah, it's not Iran and it's not Iraq. All right, it's Iran. It is a
Iran.
clause.
Okay.
Because notice, what's the verb again?
Ran.
Iran, and we have a subject. Now the question is, does this form a complete thought? Could it form a complete thought?
Yes, good.
Yes,
Independent
it can.
clause.
Yes,
It can.
it's an independent clause. It can form a complete thought. All right. Now notice, compare these last two sentences here. I ran home and I ran. Those are both clauses, and both of them form a complete sentence, even though one has an object. See that?
Mm.
So not all independent clauses or sentences have an object. they can form a complete thought without one sometimes. All right? So just keep that in mind. Let's do another one. Anselmo will give this one to you, unless Pastor Bobby has another joke.
I'll mute my mic.
Okay, Anselmo, can you read this and then tell us, is this a phrase or a clause? You're muted. There you go.
And you have... Hello.
Yeah, okay, good. I can hear you.
Okay. It is a phrase, sir.
It's a phrase. Why is that?
I think there's no subject and a verb.
Yeah, there's no verb, is there? So this phrase has to modify something else. Okay, it does not stand alone. By the way, no phrase forms a complete thought. Okay, because there's no action. And there's no verb and subject together. So that no phrase will form a complete thought. All right? Just keep that in mind. So if you have a phrase, there's no complete thought there. Okay, good. Escarzón, we'll give you the next one. Is this a phrase or a clause?
It's a phrase.
It's a phrase. Now, why do you say that? Because we have a verb here. See the verb? So why did you say it's a phrase?
A phrase because it has no subject.
Exactly. No subject, though. So a phrase can have a verb, but not in this case. It's not a sentence because there's no subject attached with it. We would need to know what is the subject. Who ate? All right. Okay. Now, here we go. James, I added one word here. What is this? James, is this a phrase or a clause?
Clause.
It's a clause. And why do you say that? Do you see a subject and a verb?
Yes. The subject is
Where's the verb? Ate? Yep.
yes.
And the subject is I. All right. And does this form a complete thought?
Yes.
It does. Good. So it's an independent clause, which means it forms a complete thought. All right. It can stand alone and it says something. Forms a complete thought. A complete thought meaning an action and someone doing the action, and then often someone receiving that action. Okay? All right, very good. Pastor Allen, how about this one? Is this a phrase or a clause? And remember, you have a clause when you have a subject and a verb. You have a phrase if there is not a subject. It's a clause,
That's
right?
a clause.
Because we have a subject and a verb, don't we?
Yeah.
Okay, what's the verb here?
Is.
It's a state of being. Now, is this a complete thought? Is it an independent clause?
Not really.
Yeah, not really.
No. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when Yahweh said I am, right, or he is, that in that
Yes.
context, it was a complete thought.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. But this is not a complete thought. We could put an asterisk, here, because oops, sorry. Depends on context. All right.
Depending on the context.
Just this statement standing by itself doesn't form a complete thought. All right.
Mhm.
Now,
Yeah.
here we go. Brother Pastor Arn, can you answer this one? Good morning. If you unmute yourself and then let us know, is this a phrase or a clause? It's like you're still muted. Are you able to unmute? Oh. All right. Maybe we'll have Pastor Noor do this one then. I can't hear you, Brother Arn. You still are on mute. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'll have Pastor Noor do it, all right? All right,
This is a
Pastor.
phrase.
Okay, phrase. Now remember, do we have a subject and a verb here?
The subject is he. The verb is happy.
The verb here is, it's the state of being. So we have a subject, he, and a condition is. That's the verb. So if we do have a subject and a verb here, I'll just put it in parentheses, he and a verb. So by definition then, this is a clause because it has both the subject and the verb. Okay?
Oh,
Now, is this a complete thought? Does this form a complete
Yes.
thought? It does.
Yes.
So it's an independent.
Standalone.
It's an independent clause. Yeah, we can say it stands alone.
and then clause.
A complete thought. Now I'll show you why I'm focusing on this idea of a complete thought in a little bit. All right. So he is happy. That gives us a complete thought. So, and it is a clause because the subject and the verb. All right. Let's do another one here. Pastor Michael, it's your turn. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
It's a phrase
It's a phrase. Now, why do you say that?
because there is no verb and a subject.
Yeah, there's no verb and there's no subject, right? All right. So therefore, it is not a complete thought because phrases never form a complete thought. They modify something else in the sentence. Okay. So those are just some examples. Now let me give you a few more. We talked about a subject, a verb, and an object, and that some sentences can have an object, others may not. Let's go to a few more examples. Are you with us, Brother Alex? Are you there?
Just arrived, Pastor.
Oh, okay. So you're still listening in? Do you want to take a shot at this to see if you can identify the subject, verb, and the object? You want to try?
Subject is he, the verb is hit.
Okay, good. What's the
The
object?
object is ball.
Yeah, there you go. Again, simple sentence, but he is the subject. And again, the subject is the one doing the action. Hit is the verb, that is the action. And in this case, the ball is called the object. It's the object or the recipient of the action. Okay? All right. All right, let's go back up to Sir Sid. Identify for me, please, the subject, verb, and object in the sentence.
Subject, he. Verb, hit. Object, ball.
Okay? Same as sentences before, but what about with the bat? Is that a subject, verb, or object?
That's a modifier.
Yes. Is it a phrase or a
Modify.
clause?
It's a phrase.
It's a phrase.
With the but. Phrase.
And it's modifying.
That's the prepositional phrase modifying but. Oh, modifying hit.
Hit. right? It tells us how he hit the ball. Okay? All right, very good. Anselmo, let me give you the next one. We've already seen this sentence, but I'd like you to identify a subject, verb, and an object here, if there is one.
Subject. He.
What's the subject?
He, sir.
Okay, very good. And the verb?
Is.
Is. Remember, this is a state of being. Now, is there an object here? Is something receiving an action?
Happy is a condition.
Yeah, it's not an object. All right, so there's no object in this sentence. That word happy is the
Adjective.
characteristic. I won't get into the grammatical. Yeah, I'm not going to give you the grammatical terms for it, but it's not an object in this case. It's not receiving an action because there's no action.
It's the adjective.
Yeah, it's the predicate adjective. So an object, again, remember, is what receives an action. Okay? Happy here
Yes.
is not receiving an action. Okay? It is the
Describing.
state of the subject.
State.
Okay? So I want to distinguish again between the verbs of being. Is, were, become, was. Okay? Those are verbs of being.
Was, were.
Verbs of
being.
action would be things like, hit, ran, walk, those kinds of things. All right, so there's two kinds of verbs. So whenever you see is or were, became, become, those are going to describe a state of being. And so there won't be an object. Okay? Because there's no action. There's nothing receiving an action. Because a verb of being is not an action, it's a state. It's a condition. All right? Are there any questions on this? So we're covering a lot of details here, so I don't want to be confusing, but is there any question here so far? Okay. Now, for some of you, this is just, it's old review, but I know for others, this may be, I just want to cover some basics regarding English grammar because it will be helpful for our diagramming. So I just want to make sure we're all together on this, all right, and understanding where we're at, okay? Pastor Bobby, did you have a question? You're muted. You're still muted.
It is very helpful, Pastor Tim.
Okay.
Even for us to went through this already before, but it's refreshing.
Okay.
It's updating us.
And when I give you an exercise to do, please don't feel intimidated. But I know I'm an English speaker. I know sometimes it can feel you don't want to speak English around English speakers. I know sometimes when I go to an event, like we're eating or something, and I sit down, no one wants to sit with me when I'm in the Philippines because they're afraid to use their English with me. So I don't want you to have that fear or concern. I'm trying to help you with this because the better you are at English, the better you'll be able to use the English resources, and the better you'll be able to use the English translations for study, okay? So I don't want you to feel embarrassed, or if there's something you don't know, it's okay. I want to help you.
Pastor Tim.
Yes, sir.
Tim. They have this expression, nosebleed.
Yes.
When we are encountering English speakers, we have this expression, nosebleed.
Yeah.
So that's why people are alof.
Yeah. They don't want to get nosebleed with the. I
We are
noticed that.
born again already. We are born again already.
Amen, brother. All right, so yeah, I just want you to feel comfortable and at ease as we go through this together, because you know, we're trying to just remind ourselves, review, or teach. Maybe some of these things you haven't had expressed to you in this way, and so I want to be able to kind of fill in maybe some gaps that you might have. All right? All right, so let's keep going. I'm going to give some more examples. Now, again, what I'm asking you to do in these is to identify the subject and the verb and the object if there is one. All right? I forgot where we're at. I think, who just went? Escarzon, let me give this one to you. Is there can you identify a subject and a verb here?
The verb, run.
Okay, we've got a verb, run. Is there a subject?
No subject.
No subject.
No subject, Pastor Tim, because the subject ran already.
Yeah, what if I said this?
That's implied, Pastor Tim.
Implied what?
It's an imperative. That is the implication. There is you run.
Yes.
You must run.
That's
You run.
You.
that is an imperative. That's a form of a command. That's why it can be a sentence with a one word, because it's an imperative.
Very
The
good.
subject is implied you.
Yeah. So in this case, and we have this a lot in Scripture, almost every command, most commands, the subject is not given. Right? When Jesus said, make disciples,
Silent. Silent.
there's no you make disciples. He just said, make disciples. The Greek word has within it the implied subject. All right? And in English, we do the same thing. We usually don't say, you go do that. We just say, go do that. Or if I'm telling my kids, I don't say, you run. I just say, run. Okay? So in this case, it's kind of interesting. We have a one-word sentence, and it forms a complete thought. So it's kind of interesting. There is no object here, though, right? Nothing is receiving. There's no object because nothing is receiving the action. Okay? So again, a sentence does not have to have an object. Many do, but they don't have to. You can still have a complete thought without an object. So a complete thought, you know, will have a subject and a verb, and may often have an object as well. All right, but it will always have an action and an actor, the one doing the action, the subject. It may have an object, the one receiving the action, but not always. All right, so this is just one example. Okay, let's see. So how does this all tie into the diagram? Yes. Michael?
How about if we're going to ask a question? Let's say, for example, we're going to ask why. Is that, can we consider that as a complete sentence? Just asking why, aside from having, one word, let's say, for example, a verb, run. So the subject there is implied. But when we use the word why in asking the question, is that giving us a complete thought, or?
Well, let's go through that's a great question. Let's go through what we've looked at. Is why, if you have just why, is that a phrase or a clause? Is there a question? Is there a subject and a verb here?
Yeah.
No. There isn't. There's no subject or verb. Now, you would have to attach this to another sentence. He spoke rudely to his mother. Why? All right. Now this connects to this sentence here, but why by itself does not form a complete thought. Okay, there's no subject and verb. Okay, so it is not a clause. It's not a complete thought. It requires words around it to give it understanding. Now, if this sentence here, he spoke rudely to his mother, that forms a complete thought. Okay?
Pastor Tim, the why needs a context.
Yeah, the why, very good. That's a good way to put it. The why needs a context. So when we have it next to he spoke rudely to his mother, why? The implication is, why did he speak rudely to his mother? But see, we only know that because of the sentence before. Okay? If we did not have the sentence before, we would not understand this question.
Yes.
Now, there was a famous bumper sticker in that I saw years ago when I was a kid. Why ask why? I have no idea what it meant. But anyway, but why by itself is just, it's a question, but it has there's no understanding without a context. Okay? It needs a context to be able to answer. Michael, does that make sense?
I'm just clarifying that for everybody.
Okay.
Because that is also a single word.
Yes.
It's being with the period at the end. Before, prior to the word why, because we consider sometimes a sentence if it is being used after a sentence also.
Yeah.
We consider that as a complete if it's prior with a dot or a period, then you consider that as a sentence already.
Yeah, in English, if you have a period here, that often indicates a sentence, but not always. If
yes.
So that's why when I said run, I put an exclamation point, because that tells you I'm actually giving it in the form of a command. If I just have the word run there, it's hard to know, is this a complete thought or not? We'd need context. But if I did this, then you know by that exclamation point, I'm actually giving a command. Run. Okay? So I'm just trying to show you variety. Yes, Escazon.
The single word verb can only be a clause and only if it has an exclamation point, right?
Only if it's a command. A verb can be a clause only if it is a command. Okay? And we're going to talk about verbs. Verbs are very, very important. They drive the action. They drive the understanding of what's happening within a paragraph. And so we're going to break down how you analyze a verb, because it's important. If you're going through a section in an epistle and you have a series of commands, and then one verb that's not a command that sticks out, or vice versa, if you have a series of verbs that are just statements, instruction, and then one command there's a difference there that you want to be able to note, pay attention to. I can make a statement that I run every day to stay healthy. Okay, is that a command or a statement? It's a statement.
It's a declarative.
I'm declaring something. Yes, it's a statement. Now, if I say run every day to stay healthy, what did I just do here? Is that a command or a statement? It's an imperative.
It's a command.
It's a command.
Imperative.
I didn't say if you run every day. I said run every day to stay healthy. So it's more forceful, more direct. All right? So just one word, that little one letter in this case, the subject I, changes the whole nature of the sentence from a statement about me to an instruction to you. All right? So like Jesus said, that not one small letter or even a part of a letter will pass away from the law until all is fulfilled. When we're dealing with Scripture, we got to pay attention to every word and every letter even, because it can change what's being communicated by the author. All right? Again, we'll cover verbs in more detail probably next time. Maybe this time, depending on how far we get here. All right? Now, what's the point of this? It is, why am I talking about clauses and phrases and the independent clause, a subject, verb, object? It's this, for this reason. When you're diagramming a paragraph, let's say you have a paragraph in an epistle, or you're in John chapter 4, in those verses that talk about true worship, where Jesus is giving a paragraph about true worship. The goal is to identify the main sentence of that paragraph, because that is what forms the complete thought. Every other phrase or clause within that paragraph is connected to, is modifying that main sentence in some way. But you need to find the main sentence. All right? And then what you do, once you find that main sentence, then you identify each phrase and clause to see how it connects to that sentence. All right? So that's why on a diagram, the main sentence goes over to the left, and all the modifying phrases and clauses are indented from that. Now, often the main sentence occurs, or we find it at the beginning of the paragraph, but not always. All right? Let me just show you this. I took a few passages from Ephesians, since we preach from that book. And what we're going to do is identify or find the main sentence. All right? I'll do a couple of them, and then I'm going to ask you guys to do that. All right? So, for example, Ephesians 1, verses 3 and 4. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, in this case, here is my main sentence. Okay? And it's reversed here, but it's God be blessed. See that? Be is the verb here. It's a state of being. God is my subject, and then blessed is describing the state of that subject, so to speak. All right? And then every other, look at all these other words are phrases and clauses. Okay? So God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that's which God? So of our Lord Jesus Christ, is this a phrase or a clause? Is there a verb?
It's a phrase.
It's a phrase. There's no verb. And this phrase is modifying God. Who has blessed us? Okay, notice something here. Now this is interesting. Is this, okay, so here we'll put this as a phrase because there's no verb. What about this next one here? Is that a phrase or a clause? Do we have a verb?
It's a clause.
It's a clause. Because we notice we have a verb, don't we? Has blessed.
We have a verb.
Do we have a subject? Do we have a subject?
We don't have.
Who? Who is the subject, right? Has blessed is the verb, the action. Who is the subject of that action? And then notice we also have an object. Okay, so if we were to break this phrase down here, we have a subject, who, we have a verb, has blessed, and we have an object, us. Now let me ask you this. Is this phrase, does it stand alone as a complete thought?
No, it cannot stand alone.
It does not. That's correct.
Because it is introduced by a pronoun.
Yes.
Relative pronoun who.
Yeah, we don't have a complete thought because we don't know who the who is. The who is connected to God, right? it's modifying God. It's telling us something about God. And notice it's telling us this is the first is a phrase modifying God. Which God? The God of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then the second is a clause, but it also is a modifying. It's dependent. It's not
Dependent.
standalone. What's standing
Yes,
alone
sir.
is blessed be God and Father. That stands alone. Here. That's the main sentence. The next phrase modifies something in that main sentence. In this case, it modifies God. The next clause modifies God as well. All right? Now, let me continue with every spiritual blessing. Is that a phrase or a clause? Is there a verb?
A phrase,
It's a
prepositional
phrase, right?
phrase.
There's no verb, no subject, so it's modifying something, and here it's modifying blessed. How is he blessed? With every spiritual blessing. All right?
Yeah.
And we could just go through, and we just notice this one sentence here, in this paragraph, has got lots of modifying phrases and clauses. All right? We have a main sentence here. That's the complete thought, and it happens at the beginning of the paragraph, and then all the phrases and clauses after that are modifying something either in the original main sentence, or in this case, this phrase is modifying something in one of the other modifying phrases. All right? And so the diagram is meant to break all these down so you can see what phrase or clause is modifying what word. And then identify, we want to find the main sentence, the main subject verb. All right? So let's do that. I'll do one more, and then I'm going to call on you guys. Therefore, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time because the days are evil. Now notice here we have several verbs. Be careful, making, that's a verb, it's an action, right? And are. Now, where's the main sentence here? Well, it is
Be
given
careful how you
at the
walk.
beginning. Be careful how you walk. That's my main sentence. All right? We have the subject. Notice here, this is in the form of a command, isn't it? So there's an implied subject, you. The recipients of the letter, the Ephesians. Okay? He's telling the Ephesians, you Ephesians, be careful how you walk. And so the verb here is be careful. All right? And then how you walk is actually modifying the verb. All right? And notice that how you walk then, this phrase modifies that. How are they to walk? By the way, walk is a verb as well. So how you walk, and this phrase is modifying walk, and this phrase is modifying walk. That's why I'm indenting it under walk. Okay? So all of these, again, we have a phrase here because there's no verb. There's no verb here. And we have clauses here. Because the days are evil. All right, that's a clause. And in this case, it's an independent clause because it forms a complete thought, but it's linked to the main sentence through this verb because. Okay, so I have it modifying under be careful because it's telling us why are we to be careful? Or sorry, why are we to make the most of our time? Because the days are evil. All right, so this last statement is even though it's a clause, it's modifying. It's modifying the word making because it's explaining why. Why make the most of our time? Because the days are evil. Okay, so the days are evil is a clause. We have a verb are and we have the subject days. But in this case, it doesn't stand by itself because notice that word because. That links it to making the most of your time. Okay? But the main sentence of this paragraph is be careful how you walk. And it too is at the beginning. All right. Now we're going to get into some more.
I have a question, sir.
Yes. Anselmo.
Go back to our this one. This word, sir, is making the most of your time. I want to ask a question in this
Yes.
phrase, sir, because this is a present past participle.
Yes,
Present
making.
participle.
Yes.
Making. Sometimes I'm confused with past participle. Correct me if I'm wrong. Past participle, it happens in the past and still applicable in the present. This one, sir.
Yeah, in English, let's see, what would be
That
in
is
English,
present
a
participle
past one.
making.
Yeah, it would be presented this way in English. Having made the most of your time. Okay, that would be a participle, a past tense participle. Making would be a present tense participle. Making means, you know, doing it now.
Ongoing.
Ongoing. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Ongoing. Having made is describing, that's a past tense. Okay, it's already happened. So what in this case, let's say we had these two, so be careful how you walk. Making the most of your time. So Paul would be saying, that if it's present tense, he's saying this is how you walk carefully, by making the most of your time. Or redeeming your time is another translation. Now, if he had said, be careful how you walk, having made the most of your time, he's changing something. You having already done this it was an activity you did in the past, but it's not a main activity. You can think of a participle like this. We have what's called a main verb. And then we have what's called, I'll call it a supporting verb.
Auxiliary verb.
Yeah, there's auxiliary, there's
Helping verb.
subordinate,
Thinking verb.
there's a lot of different terms for this. There's non-finite.
Linking and helping verbs.
There's other kinds of linking. Helping verbs are a little different. That's a little different category. But I'm just going to call it a supporting verb. Okay? So we have sentences that have main verbs like this. It would be a simple sentence. I'll just say he walked to SM. All right? Or the SM. Now, that's a main verb. Okay? Walked. This is the main sentence. Walked is the verb, he is the subject, and then we have a description of where he walked. Now, if I had said he walked to the SM, whistling all the way. Okay? Now, notice the whistling here is a verb, isn't it? Whistling is a verb. Now, is it a main verb? Is it the main idea or main thought here?
No,
It's
sir,
not. It's supporting. It's supporting the main thought in some way. So in this case, whistling, participles almost always modify another main verb. In this case, it's modifying walked. It's describing, yes.
You can replace the comma also with an and.
No, not you can't actually in this case because it's a participle.
It's a participle.
If I had written it this way, he walked to
And
the
whistled.
SM and whistled.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, that was going to be my next example because in this case, we actually have two main verbs.
Yeah.
All right, that's why you see this word subordinate here?
Yeah.
Subordinate means to come under. It's not the most important, it's subordinate to. It's like ranks in the military. You know, a captain is subordinate to a major. A major
Chain of
tells the
command.
captain what to do.
The
all right?
chain of command.
It's a chain of command. A captain tells a private what to do. He's subordinate. And in this case, a participle is subordinate to the main verb. It comes under the main verb. And why I'm bringing this up is, and why this is really important is for this reason. Because if you were preaching this passage, the focus of the author is walked. He walked to the SM. That's the main action the author wants you, the recipient, to understand. Whistling all the way tells us what he was doing while he was walking, but it's not at the same level or importance. All right? Because I used walk as, that's the only main verb here. Whistling is, I put it in the form of a participle, this ing, because it's less important. Walk is the most important action here. Whistling is a subordinate action. Now, if I had worded it this way, he walked to the SM and whistled all the way. Now I'm giving two main verbs. They're both of equal importance. All right? Now I'm telling you two things that are important, to me anyway, as the author. He walked to the SM, and this is how we would diagram it, and, because he whistled all the way. So if I were preaching this text, if you will, I would have 2 points. The first point, he walked to the SM. The second point, the second main idea, he whistled all the way. Now, if I were preaching this passage, this text, I would have one main point. He walked to the SM. And then under that would be, what did he do while he was walking? He was whistling. But here, there's two main actions. All right? This may not seem like a big deal here, but when you're preaching through a passage, you want to make sure to emphasize what the author's emphasizing. So one very famous example of this would be make disciples, right? Jesus said, make disciples. And then he said, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you, right? You remember this text, right? Now, notice here, make disciples. That is a verb. The implied subject is you. You make disciples, he said, of all the nations, right? But here we have a participle, baptizing. It's a participle. That means it's subordinate. It's not the main verb. It's supporting the main verb. All right? So baptizing and teaching are not the main verb, but support. I'll use this word again, subordinate to the main verb. And what is the main verb? Make disciples. So when you preach this passage, the emphasis is not baptizing, the emphasis is not teaching, the emphasis is make disciples. The participles here tell us how. How do we make disciples? 1, baptizing, 2, teaching. But the main command is not baptize. The main command is not teach. The main command is make disciples. Okay? Now, what if Jesus had said it this way? Make disciples and baptize them and teach them. What has changed? Now we have 3 statements of equal importance. And notice too, we've modified now the meaning of make disciples is now different. Because in some way, if he had said it this way, make disciples and baptize them and teach them, the make disciples would be a separate action. Okay, but notice he didn't say it that way, because make disciples is not a separate thing. It is the main command, and baptizing and teaching are the way to fulfill that command. That's how you make disciples. That's very different than if he had said, make disciples and baptize and teach. Are you following me here? If not, ask a question. I want to make sure. This is really, really important, because it changes. If I don't notice these participles here, then I'm missing what Jesus is instructing. Because make disciples is not some separate concept. He's telling us, how do I make a disciple? How do I make a follower of Christ? By baptizing and by teaching. If Jesus had said, make disciples and baptize and teach, now he's giving 3 instructions, and then I'm not sure what make disciples means. It means something else then. But because Jesus used the participles, he was defining for us how to make disciples, because participles are supporting the main verb. All right? They're not a main verb themselves. Questions on this or comments? Does that make sense?
Mhm.
We'll see a lot of we see lots of participles in Paul loves participles, by the way. But we'll see them in every New Testament book and often many Old Testament books. But Paul loves participles. So, and it's important to see them, because then we have to go, oh, there's a participle. Okay, that's not the main action. It's supporting the main action. Let me find the main action. All right. And in fact, I think I've got a sentence here. We're going to see another sentence in a minute with the participle. But notice we saw one already, making the most of your time. All right, that's not a main action. It's supporting the verb walk. All right. How are we to walk? By making the most of our time. That's what it looks like. Redeeming our time. And then he gives a reason. Why are we to make the most of our time? Because the days are evil. Okay. Now, if he had said, be careful how you walk and make the most of your time, now he's giving us 2 separate commands, 2 separate statements, 2 separate ideas. But because he uses the participle, it's one idea with the description of how that idea is to be done. How are you to walk? By making the most of your time. Okay? So this is why it's very important you identify participles, because they will support or explain the main verb. Okay?
Pastor Tim?
Yes.
Yeah. As you pointed out a while back in Matthew 28, your previous explanation. So we will assume that the conjunction is the identifying or distinguishing word that distinguishes between a modifying phrase and an independent clause, okay, or a different idea. Okay.
You mean
Usually there will be a conjunction. No? And when you
and,
put the conjunction, at least from my understanding, when you put the conjunction, okay, distinguishing it as likely another thought, the participles changes. As you gave the example below, no? Make disciples and baptize them. So you
oh, I
lose the
see. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
participle now. If you add the conjunction, most of the time you lose the participle.
Yeah, if because you wouldn't have make disciples and baptizing them and teaching them. That wouldn't make sense. So you're saying, yeah, that additional conjunction also, this additional conjunction here also helps to see that
Yeah.
there are three. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you will see that. Now sometimes though in English, right,
Mm.
the author may not put all of the conjunctions in. He might have said that, make disciples, baptize them, and teach them. But there is an implied conjunction there. But we would know that it's three main verbs, because here that's baptize, not baptizing. So that's not a participle. Teach is not a participle. Teaching would be a participle. And remember what I expressed to you before, in the Greek language, if you look up the interlinear, you can see there if it's actually a participle or a main verb in Greek. And we'll maybe do that as an example as we do some diagramming. But I really, really want you to understand this point. You know, why do we care? Why are we so focused on the participle or not? It's because a participle is not a main verb, therefore it's not expressing the main thought, it's supporting the main thought in some way. So as you teach the passage, you have to see that so that your people rightly understand what's being said. As I've said before, Jesus's main command here is make disciples, and by the participles he's showing us how to do that. Okay? As opposed to if he had said, make disciples and baptize and teach, that would have been three separate commands of equal importance. And it would also have mean that this make disciples has some other idea. Because then it would not mean make disciples as baptizing and teaching, it would be something else, because he gives baptize and teach as separate commands. But that's not what Jesus said. Okay?
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
also going back to Anselmo's question, so he was asking if I remember, okay, Anselmo, correct me now.
Yes, sir.
But your question was, I remember, sometimes you're confused of past actions done in the past, but it has an ing, no, that brands it as a participle. Your question is, does the action continues in the present? Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
Past
that,
participle.
yeah, like so for
Participle. Yeah.
yeah, the example I gave was here. These two sentences, right? That the actual sentence was making the most of your time. That's present. So it is, how do you walk? This is how you walk, by making the most of your time. Now the second one is past. It's a participle, but it's happened in the past. It's not happening now. It's something that happened before.
Okay.
And
So
I
that
think
is a
the
different idea.
past participle, I think, is it's like if the writer is describing a past event, and during that time it's happening, I think that's the past participle. It happened in the past, but looking at it in the past, it's happening then. It's like that.
It can. Greek gets a little tricky. There are different ways that it's expressed. Without getting into the details, you have a perfect tense, you have an aorist tense, you have a present tense, a you also have what's called a pluperfect. So there are different ways. There are some participles that are past action with present results. There are some participles past action only. There are other participles past action, it was ongoing action. And there are other participles which are present. Are you confused yet?
Pastor Tim.
I try to insert, sir.
Yeah.
I try
Pastor
to
Tim.
insert, sir.
Anselmo, go ahead.
If correct my discoveries, there is a participle that it happened in the past, but still applicable in the present.
That's called a perfect tense Greek verb. Yeah. Yeah. If we look at Greek verbs, all right, you
Pastor
have.
Tim.
Yes.
That's the case of conjunction, conjugation. That's the case of
Correct.
conjugation.
That's correct. Okay, so you have these different tenses in Greek. There's 7, if I remember correctly. I think I'm forgetting one. But you have a present tense, an aorist, which sometimes is usually past, a perfect tense, and that's the one you're talking about, Anselmo, where it's a past action with present or recurring results. So, one example. Why does this matter? By grace, you have been saved. You remember Ephesians 2:8? By grace you've been saved. It's not of yourselves, it is a gift of God. You have been saved is in the perfect tense. Why does that matter? If it were past tense, then it's an event that it just happened in the past. But because Paul put it in the perfect tense, it's a past act, but it has present impact, present results. So it's like that's why some translations say, by grace you are saved. And that's almost a legitimate translation because it is a past action, but it does have present effect. So we've been saved in the past, but it has ongoing results into the present and into the future. Okay? That makes sense? So this is more Greek. In English, you have been saved would be a way to express that idea. It doesn't say by grace you are saved. That would be present tense. Or by grace you were saved. So here would be an example. By grace you are saved. That's a present tense. By grace you were saved. That's a past tense.
Yeah.
Okay?
There's a big difference there.
And then, but Paul said, by grace you have been saved. That's a perfect tense, which again means past action that has present and in some cases in the Greek text and even and possibly future results. Okay? And that's significant theologically, isn't it?
Yeah.
You were saved at some time in the past, right? You made a profession, you repented and believed, but it still has an effect now and in the future. It's not just an event that is done, but it has ongoing effects or results in our lives. So that's an encouraging thing to consider. Okay, Paul could have used an aorist tense to say, by grace you were saved at one time, but he wants to make sure we understand that that wasn't something that happened only in the past, but it has a present impact. And he didn't say by grace you are saved. He wasn't saying that it's some ongoing thing happening now. It was an event that took place in the past, but it has ongoing results. It continues. The effect of it continues. The actual action isn't continuing, but the effect of the action continues. Okay?
So we're not talking anymore about simple ing participle.
No, this is a different, I started it from here, having made is a past. In English, this is represented as a past participle. So it's something
I'm
that
just
happened in the past.
continuing Anselmo's question.
Yeah. So Anselmo's question, both of these cases, you have a participle that's ongoing now. That's this one. Or if he had written it this way, it'd be a participle that had taken place in the past. Now, what's important here is to recognize in both of these cases, each of these would be modifying the main verb here. Okay? Be careful how you walk. It's describing how you walk. In this case, it's describing now how you walk today. If the second one, it's saying that be careful how you walk, and it's almost giving a reason to be careful because it's saying because you made the most of your time in the past. It's a totally different idea that would have been expressed.
Yeah.
Okay? Now he didn't say the second one. It was the first one here, making the most, because he's describing there how you walk. But if he was using a past participle, he would be describing some other event that now affects, it tells us why we need to be careful how we walk because of something that happened in the past.
Yep.
Different interpretation, simply by the tense of the participle.
All right.
Anselmo, does that help a little bit, or do you have more question there?
Well, sir. Helpful because I pointing out some verses in the Bible that, like for example, having cleansed. So it already happened in the past. I think Book of Hebrews I encountered that.
That's a good one. Let me here's a passage that let's skip over. This is a really good question. Let me open up my Bible here, and I want to show you. I think it'll be another passage in Hebrews, but it's the same idea. It's this one that's more familiar. Okay. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside. Let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. What does this look like here in terms of the main sentence? Let us lay aside, right? It's not this one. Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, that's modifying something else. Let us lay aside. That is the main subject, us, and the main verb is lay aside. And then he says, let us run with endurance. So let me do this. I'm going to copy this onto, I should have just done it this way. Okay, let me paste it over here. Okay. Oh, oops. All right, sorry. And give me a minute to. All right, I just took. All right, so we have therefore, and then we have this since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. Let me break this down a little bit, and then I'll explain it. All right. The main sentence appears to be, let us lay aside every encumbrance. And then there's a second, and so he's giving two statements here. Let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. All right. So notice we have how many commands here? Let us lay aside every encumbrance. 1, let us lay aside the sin. 2, let us run with endurance. 3. See that? These are our main verbs. Lay aside every encumbrance, lay aside the sin, and let us run. Okay? So we could say, let us lay aside 2 things and let us run with endurance. Now, if you were preaching this, you might have then, I'm sorry, I said 3. I meant to say 2 points. You might have 2 points here, right? Point number 1, let us lay aside every encumbrance. Point number 2, let us run with endurance. Right? Everybody with me so far? And then there's the reason, since we have a great cloud of witnesses, the sin he modifies, which so easily entangles us. Run, how do we run? With endurance. And then fixing our eyes. Okay, this is how I would block diagram. Okay? All right. Now, just change this to there. Okay, so this is the diagram. And how this would end up being in my outline is 2 points. Point number 1, let us lay aside 2 things. Every encumbrance, let us lay aside the sin. Point number 2, let us run, how? With endurance, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Now, there's one little problem here, men. This verb, problem with the translation. This verb run is a main verb, okay? It's a present tense command. This verb, let us lay aside, is a aorist participle. Okay, or in Selmo, it's actually having laid aside is actually the literal translation. All right. So it should be having laid aside. This is how the translation, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, having laid aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, let us run with endurance. All right, this is how the translation should be literally. That lay aside is actually a participle. And it's a past tense participle. So the main sentence.
The main sentence is number 2, Pastor Tim.
The main sentence is, let us run with endurance. I'm going to highlight it in a different color. There's actually one main thought here. It's let us run with endurance.
Correct.
And a subordinate statement is laying aside. Having laid aside every encumbrance and the sin, what I think, how I interpret this text is he's describing having repented, essentially. Let us run with endurance. And I have a whole sermon on this, of course, in that it connects to the whole chapter 11 and chapter 10. The whole idea there is endurance.
Yeah.
Having enduring faith, right? Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. He gives all those examples of faith. Why? Because at the end of chapter 10, he's saying, you're not enduring. You need to endure.
That's correct.
Look at all these people that have gone before us. Moses, Abraham, Sarah. And he goes on these lists, and he ends it with Jesus. He's the chief example. But the main focus in that whole chapter 10 at the end all the way into chapter 12 is this idea of endurance. And so
Yeah.
here, I don't know why the translations did this, but this makes it sound like there's actually two commands.
Mm.
But in the original Greek, it's one command, let us run with endurance. And it's a supporting idea is having laid aside every encumbrance. So, because again, this is the argument for the entire letter of Hebrews. He's saying, look, you've claimed to follow Christ. Don't give up. Endure. That's the whole point of the letter of Hebrews, is there's these people who've come out of Judaism who are now having these trials and difficulties, and now they're tempted to go back. And so the author of Hebrews, whether it's Paul or someone else, he's telling them, look, Jesus is better. Jesus is greater. Jesus is the high priest. Jesus is far above any angel. Jesus is far above Moses. Don't go back. And yet there are some that are wavering, some that are tempted to go back. And so Hebrews 10 through 12, the focus is endure, endure. And so they've already made a profession. If they're truly Christians, they have laid aside every encumbrance because they've repented. And so his focus is he's saying, let us run with endurance. So this changes. If this is a participle, then how we would diagram it is actually this way. It's because it's literally, let me just put the literal, having laid aside every encumbrance. It's going to modify how we, going to modify run. But it's not saying, it's not telling us how we run. If he had said laying aside every encumbrance, that's present tense. That would be telling us how we run. But he's saying having laid aside. That, Anselmo, is a past tense participle. So it's something that has been done in the past. But it's subordinate to run. Because this has happened, run. Because this has already taken place, run with endurance.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay, thank you, sir.
So the English
turn-
word having will be your biggest clue about if it's a past tense. That's the way the English would express a past tense participle. And again, this reminds us that we really have to go to the interlinear and check our passage. Check every verb. Make sure, is this a participle or a main verb? All right. And this passage is one I've commonly seen missed when it's preached. It's often preached as two commands. But this having laid aside is not a command. It's a participle, which means it's modifying, it's subordinate to, it's supporting another verb in the sentence. And in this case, the main verb we actually find is not in verse 1, it's in verse 2, let us run. All right?
Sometimes, Pastor Tim,
yeah.
One of the reference point we can use also is the context and
yes,
whole flow of the thought of the context.
That's how I make my argument here. I make it one grammatically because it's a participle having laid aside, but two, I make it by the context, and the context, the whole focus is on endurance. That word endure is repeated 5, 6, 7 times in a chapter and a half. And so that's really the author's focus.
The turning point is Hebrews chapter 10, the last verses of Hebrews chapter 10.
Yeah. Where he's talking about that they're wavering, that they're not enduring. And so he gives those examples of those who have endured, and then he gives the command to endure. And then he tells us the way we do that is we run, how? With endurance. How do we run with endurance? By fixing our eyes on Jesus. He's the chief example. By the way, let's just finish. When he says the author and perfecter, the text is literally of the faith, not of our faith. The author and perfecter means, one, he is the chief. Author has the idea of a chief or most important. He's the chief example of faith, right? There was that whole list in chapter 11 of all those people. Well, who's the greatest example of faith?
Jesus.
Jesus is. So he saves that for the end. He gave all these other examples, but then at the end he says Jesus is the author. That means he's the preeminent, the greatest example.
Mhm.
And then perfecter means this idea of he lived it out. The author means example. Perfecter means the one who actually lived out a full life of faith. So he's not saying that he's the author of our faith, though he is, but not in this text. He's not saying that. Jesus is the one who is the author of our faith, and he's the one who sanctifies us. He's the perfecter of our faith. But in this passage, he's actually saying he's the author and perfecter of the faith, meaning chapter 11, it was all about examples of faith. Jesus is one, the chief example, the greatest example, and two, he's the one that lived a complete life of faith. He's the perfecter of it, meaning he is the mature one. He lived a full life of faith at every step.
The embodiment of.
That's a great word. The embodiment of it.
The embodiment of,
Yeah, that's a perfect
of what it should be.
He's the chief example of faith, and he's the embodiment of faith. Something like that. Okay, but the main thing I wanted to see here was just, here we have an example of a past participle and how it modifies the main verb run, and it's basically saying, because you've laid aside every encumbrance, endure. Run with endurance. All right? Now, if it had said laying aside every encumbrance, it would be telling us how we endure. That's the difference. If it's present tense, it's describing some way now that action is supporting the main verb. But if it's a past participle, it's saying because that action has taken place, we run.
Amen.
Okay?
Amen.
All right. Well, I hope that helped a little bit.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Amen. Praise the Lord.
All right. Well, let's we'll just stop right here.
We'll stop now.
It's 10
I
o'clock.
thought we would have, Pastor Tim, I thought we will have 4 hours because we did that last time.
It's 10 p.m. my time.
You.
Here, we'll do. Yeah, let's. I think that's good. We'll come back, do some more examples next week, and then I'll show you how. Then, when we go to the diagram, how it will help us in regards to our diagramming. Okay, but the idea that I wanted you to see is, one, we were breaking down. A paragraph is broken down into sentences, and the sentences are broken down into phrases and clauses. So I want you to be able to understand the difference. And then two, to understand I want to find out the main sentence in my paragraph, because that goes over to the left and everything will come from that. All the next phrases and clauses will be modifying either something in that main sentence or modifying something in another phrase or clause, which modifies that main sentence. All right? But like I said, just showing you even here, these diagrams, when you understand that, then we understand, okay, I have a participle here, so that's not the main sentence. It's modifying something else. And in this case, we understand it's modifying the main verb here of run, describing, because this has happened, let us run.
Okay.
All right? But so when I preach it, I don't have 2 points, I have 1 point, because that's my main sentence. Now, well, here, I'll do this example with you because it'll explain my final point. So we have here, therefore, be imitators of God. Okay, notice I have my verb, be, and the implied subject is what?
You.
Subject is you, because it's a command, isn't it? Subject is you, so in this case it's the Ephesians. The verb is be. All right? So you be, and he describes your imitators. That's the main sentence. Now, as beloved children describes how. So I put that under B. But then notice there's a second main sentence here. And you, again, the implied subject, you walk in love. So here's how I would diagram it. I always,
Amen.
you be imitators and you walk in love. How? Just as Christ also loved you, or the reason, just as Christ loved you. All right, so all of these, just as Christ loved you, and Christ gave himself up for us. Okay, and then so all of these other things are modifiers. But notice, there's, in this case, I do have two. If I were to preach this text, I would have 2 points. Okay? Because I have really 2 main sentences, or 1 main sentence with 2 actions. Be imitators is the first. Walk in love is the second. And then all these other phrases are just modifying. Okay, here's a phrase, as beloved children. It modifies be. It describes how we're to be imitators. We have this, just as Christ loved you. This is a clause, but it's not the main clause. It's supporting, walk in love. Why? Just as Christ loved you. Or how? How do we walk in love? Just as Christ loved you and gave himself up for us as an offering and a sacrifice. Okay? So in this case, these are both finite or main verbs. They're connected by the conjunction and so they form two main points, 2 main ideas. Whereas in the last thing I showed you from Hebrews, there's just 1 main sentence. Let us run. Okay? So what this does is when you can find those main sentences in your paragraph, that tells you how many points you have, or how many points the author is making, and how many points then you'll have in your sermon. And then all the other phrases and clauses will just be connected to those main sentences in some way.
Pastor Tim, we need exegetical tools, no? You have to go back to the interlinear.
The interlinear help. And also
final.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, as final check.
Yeah. Yeah, we're the 2 tools that can help you the most are, 1, just understanding the English grammar well, so you can take a passage like this and you see the participle, you see the phrases, you're able to identify the main sentence, the main subject and verb. And then a Greek interlinear will help you confirm the verbs if they are participle or not. All right? But those are the 2 tools that would be most helpful. I mean, you know, the 3rd tool would be go learn Greek, but you know that would take a little longer. So if we can just, for now, continue to work at learning English, so we can use the English translations, and then use the interlinear to show us, confirm for us the nature of the verbs. All right?
And the main focus, Pastor Tim, as we check the interlinear, are the verbs, right? Focus, the focus words are the verbs.
The focus words are the verbs.
Yes.
Those are the starting points in terms of understanding the
authorial.
Yeah, the authorial intent. So the verbs, we need to understand the subject and the object and those things, but what's driving the interpretation and understanding of the passage are the verbs. So seeing where the verbs are, understanding, is this a main verb or a subordinate verb? Is it a participle or is it a regular verb? And then that's how we gain understanding of and try to fit the pieces together. And is this a phrase or a clause? If it's a phrase, I know it's modifying something else for sure. If it's a clause, it could be modifying something else.
Okay.
But there's going to be a main clause, an independent clause that presents a complete thought, and that's the one that the main idea that everything else comes out of. All right. So, okay. Well, that's, I think, enough. Everyone has a nosebleed now, correct? That's enough for this week.
We're now bleeding from everywhere.
Every nose, ears, everything.
A good punch.
Pastor
And good
We
punch.
We are hemorrhaging.
Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Okay.
Hemorrhaging. Oh my goodness.
Very good hemorrhaging.
Okay. Well, we'll continue this next week. In the meantime, if you do have questions come up, Anselmo's was a very good question. Michael had a great question earlier about why. If that one word why. So yeah, if anything comes up during the week, write yourself a note so you can ask during class next week, because I think it will benefit everybody if you do have a question that comes up. All right, and if certain things don't make sense, please do not be embarrassed to ask next week questions about that. All right, we're all here to learn, and we understand that we want to all help each other to be good at studying and preaching God's word. All right, so it's important that we help each other and not feel bad if we don't understand something, because if you don't understand something, it's probably likely someone else doesn't either. All right, or when you ask that question, if you'll notice it sparks other questions or other things that we would not have looked at. We would not have looked at Hebrews 12 if Anselmo had not made a comment about this. And I hope this was a helpful passage to consider. But so that's why questions can really help all of us to learn more. So, okay, just want to encourage that. All right. Well, I'll ask Pastor Noor if you could close us in prayer. Wipe the blood from your nose and then close us in prayer. No, I'm joking. From nosebleed.
Let us pray. Loving Father, we are humbly